Hello and welcome to Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I'm here today with a guest that I'm very excited to finally have on the show. I've been wanting to get him on the show for about a year. My son, Samuel Bachman. Samuel, welcome to the show.
Hi.
So, Samuel, let's start with your podcast. Give us the name of your podcast. How many episodes have you published so far with your co-host, Diego?
The podcast is The Half-Blood Report, and I think we've published 75 as of this recording.
And remind us, what grade are you in right now?
I am in 10th grade.
10th grade. Where do you go to school?
I go to Frank Sinatra High School of the Arts in Astoria, Queens.
Cool. And you're in the film program?
Yes, I am in the film department. I'm a film major.
Film major. Okay. So let's talk about the podcast. You and your co-host Diego started it in 2019, right? Tell us the story of how and why you decided to start the podcast, or maybe even start with what is the podcast about? People who may not know what the Half-Blood Report is about.
Okay, well, I think I can start with like my idea. So I'm a big fan of Rick Riordan. Who, if you don't know, he's this best-selling author of multiple fantasy middle grade book series that which usually take various mythologies, and put them in the modern day. And he's most famous for his Percy Jackson series, which is about a middle schooler who finds out that he is a descendant, is the son of the Greek god Poseidon, and he has to stop Kronos from taking over from the gods. So I grew up reading Rick Riordan's books, and I loved them. And I think it was 2017, maybe 2018, when Rick Riordan started an imprint called Rick Riordan Presents. And so what he did with this imprint is he basically had, because for many years, people have been asking him to write about various mythologies, such as Hindu mythology or maybe the Mayan Aztec mythologies. But, him being a white guy, he didn't really feel comfortable writing about those mythologies, especially because they weren't stories he had grown up with, as he had grown up with the other mythologies he had written about. So what he ended up doing was starting this imprint where he had authors write stories from their own mythologies. So they could kind of tell stories that were from their cultures and inspired by mythologies from their part of the world. And so he started this imprint, and I read the first two books in that imprint when they came out, and I went to like an event where they're promoting some of the books, and then I kind of stopped reading for a bit. I was kind of busy with school, and then my younger sister Vero, she got diagnosed with dyslexia, and one of the big things about Percy Jackson is he's a dyslexic, and the explanation for that in the books is that he's a dyslexic because he's actually hardwired for ancient Greek, being the son of a Greek god. And so, this book that's like really accepting of those sort of different ways of learning. And so I figured, why not read this book to my sister who just got diagnosed with dyslexia? And so I did that, and she really enjoyed the series. I loved reading it to her. And then that kind of got me back into Rick Riordan. So I looked at his website, and I was like, oh my goodness, there are like so many Rick Riordan Presents books that like have come out that I haven't read. And it was like really like 3, but I also got confused because there were other books on the website that like have been announced but hadn't come out yet. And so I got really confused. I was like, geez, I wish there was a way I could have like known about all this stuff and like not been confused just checking his website a couple months gap. And so what I ended up doing was like, what if that was a podcast? And so I called my friend Diego, who's also a big fan of the books, and he was into the idea. So we started the Half-Blood Report, which is, its goal is to every week bring all the news of the fandom. So, anytime there's a new book announcement in the imprint, anytime the books come out, anytime there are promotional articles released or there's a cover release, we cover all that stuff each week. And we also do interviews with a lot of the authors when the books come out, and so that's really fun.
Tell us about some of the authors that you have interviewed.
Yeah. So the first time, the kind of one of the first books coming out as we started the podcast was Tristan Strong Destroys the World, or no, that's the second book of the series. It was Tristan Strong Punches a Hole in the Sky, and that was this book by this great author Kwame Mabalia, and so I was like, hey, we're going to the actual live in person book launch. This was back when those were a thing. And so that was like October 2019. And so I was like, Diego, if we're going to this event, I'm going to email the event organizers and see if maybe we could record an interview with the author before the event. And neither of us really thought it would go anywhere. We were just, putting ourselves out there, seeing if something would happen. And then they said yes. And so we're like, that's crazy. And so we like prepared a list of questions like, okay, maybe we'll get like a 5-minute interview and we can put that in front of our review of the book. And then we got a 20-minute interview, which was able to be its own episode. And we're like, wow, that's crazy.
Because you guys were in 9th grade and 8th grade at that point.
Yeah. We had never expected like, an author published on this very prominent imprint would give us the time of day. So, and then the craziest thing about it was, since all the authors under this imprint, they have like a community and they really like to support each other. There was another author under the imprint who lives in New York City and was at the event to support his fellow author. And so then Diego and I were able to go up to him and say, hey, would you like to be on this podcast we're kind of doing at the moment? And he said yes. And so
that was Carlos Hernandez.
Yes, that was Carlos Hernandez, who's a very funny, amazing author who's written a duology, a sci-fi duology under the imprint with kind of influence of Cuban culture. And the next thing we knew, we were just reaching out to authors whenever their books were coming out under the imprint and getting interviews. And then we were also the Broadway musical, The Lightning Thief, which is based off Rick Riordan's first book, or our first middle grade book, that was going on at the time. So we reached out to them and we're like, can we get an interview with a cast member? And we're thinking maybe we could get like, one of the minor roles, talk to someone doing that. But they let us talk to the understudy of the main role, Percy Jackson. And so then again, we recorded that interview. And the next thing we were doing like an interview every month. And then we're like, well, if we're doing an interview every month, we'll release an episode every week, because we could kind of having gaps in our releases. So then the next thing we knew, like this kind of idea I could kind of had in July was a podcast releasing episodes every week.
And what can you list out all the authors that you've interviewed so far that you can recall?
Yeah. So there was Kwame Mambalia, Carlos Hernandez. Those are the first two. Then we talked to Rebecca Rohnhorse, who is a Black and also Navajo author who wrote a book with about Navajo mythology. And she's also done a bunch of cool stuff. She's a sci-fi author. She's written like a Star Wars book. And then we talked to, I think next up we actually talked to not an author, but the main editorial director of the imprint. And she is the editor of every book under that imprint, and also the editor of all of Rick Riordan's books. So that was amazing to get to talk to her. And she was just a blast. And then we kind of had this relationship so we could keep going. And we also talked to the cover artist of all of Rick Riordan's books, and also the cover artist of the Tristan Strong books, as I talked about. And then I think our next author interview was Roshini Chokshi. She was the first author under the imprint, and just recently we talked to her a second time for book 4 of the series. The first time we talked to her for book 3 of the series.
That's the Anu Shah series?
Aru Shah.
Aru Shah.
Yeah. That's the first series on the imprint, the Hindu mythology inspired series, which is a really amazing, funny series. And then I think we talked to, I'm trying to think of all the authors we've gotten to speak with. I think after that, we talked to Carlos Hernandez again, because the second book in the duology had released. And we talked to J.C. Cervantes, or Jennifer Cervantes, who is the author of the second book in the series. We talked to her when the third book in that series came out. She was also a blast to talk to. And then we got to talk to, actually, the next thing we did was we got to talk to Rick Riordan about his book on our podcast, which was his final book in his kind of, not Percy Jackson series, but kind of the the continuation of that series. We got to talk to him about the final book in that world, and that was really awesome to do. I'm glad we got the chance to do that. And it's actually crazy because before we did that interview, readriordan.com, which is kind of the website that kind of publishes all these announcements, and they do like most of the promotion for the books. They reached out to us and asked if we wanted to do a video with Rick Riordan to promote the release of the book. And so we did. We pitched them some ideas for like funny video ideas, and then they had their own kind of ideas. And so together we produced three short videos that are all on YouTube to release the book. And then we were also able to say, Rick, would you like to come on our podcast? Which he did. So that was all really fantastic, and nothing that we might like. I thought, starting Rick Riordan podcast somewhere down the line, I'm probably going to get to talk to Rick Riordan. That probably happens if you do it eventually on like 5-6 years. That has to happen. But I never would have expected that they would have reached out to us and it would have happened in just over a year. So,
and I think some adult listeners may not be familiar with Rick Riordan if they haven't, don't have young adult kids. But if you look it up, he is one of the top 10 or 12 best-selling authors in the world in terms of total grossing sales. So it's like having, Stephen King on your podcast as a sophomore in high school. Pretty impressive.
Yes. Yeah.
Tell me a little bit like what you've learned so far about running a podcast from setting up just the two of you, because the two of you really set it up by yourselves. You've set up a website. We also should get into your Twitter and your Instagram account. But what have you learned so far about how to make how to make a podcast?
Well, one thing I learned was with social media was we would do like kind of jokey posts on social media, or sometimes we post memes on social media, which we still occasionally do. But one of the things I realized was especially with our Twitter, is like if we just did on Twitter what we preached to do with our podcast, then that only not actually gets people to follow you on Twitter, but to actually like believe in the podcast and be willing to check it out, I think. So let me just explain that. So like what I mean by doing what we preach about our podcast. So if we say our podcast is the update, everything you need to know about Rick Riordan news. So what we do is anytime someone posts anything that like might be considered newsworthy or something that we would be like interested in talking about on the podcast, we can just retweet it. And so then people, if they check out our Twitter account, they see that we're tweeting like constantly about Rick Riordan Presents News. And so that's not going to be interesting to, someone who doesn't really care about Rick Riordan. They don't want to get their Twitter feed clogged with Rick Riordan news. But we're not looking for, someone who's not that interested in Rick Riordan. That's not who we want listening to our podcast. So not that we're not interested, but it's not, our target audience, I would say. And so we're hardcore Rick Riordan fans, or fans of the imprint books. If they see our Twitter feed and they're like, I would have to follow, 10 different people to get this feed that I'm getting from this one person. Because, and also if you're following those 10 different people, you might be getting stuff that you don't want in your feed. But by retweeting, the important stuff, that gets people more interested in what you're doing. And also then once a week, we tweet about our own episode, which we release. And so that gets people willing to check out the interview, because if everything we're tweeting about is newsworthy, then our episodes probably also are.
So it's a very targeted, disciplined approach, as opposed to just general commentary or sharing political news or, things that kids in general might be just in it, just sticking to Rick Riordan. And you've grown to how many followers now on Twitter? You have a pretty good following.
Yeah, it's like 1,100 plus. I think we're nearing 1,200. And then on Instagram, I think we have 2,000 or 3,000 followers. So, not on the high end of the spectrum by any means of like other podcasts or celebrities or anything. But I think it's impressive for what we're doing and the niche that we have.
No, it's pretty respectable. And let's share those right now. We'll put them in the show notes as well. But what is your Twitter and your Instagram handles?
So our Instagram is at the Half Blood Report, and our Twitter is just at Half Report.
Half Report. Okay. What have you learned about growing an Instagram following?
I don't do as much on the Instagram as my co-host does, Diego. I'm more of the Twitter person, as you could probably tell. But my co-host, and when we kind of talked about, we do the same thing where we add like the news to our story. Another helpful thing is posting audiograms. So if you don't know what an audiogram is, you've probably even seen one before. It's a little clip of a podcast with like a little audio wave that's moving as the audio is playing, and then often there'll be like annotation to the text that's like on screen, or and then like our logo, and then it says like check out the podcast.
What do you make those with?
So we use, I think, I forget I think it was actually just like getaudiogram.com that we're using, and that was all right. But there wasn't as many things we could do, so we actually switched to Headliner. And Headliner is better because there's not a limit. There is a limit, but there's less of a limit as what we could of the amount of audiograms we could create as there was with getaudiogram.com. And also with Headliner, they actually let you like have this editing studio where you can like move stuff around, which it's not the most perfect software in the world, but it's definitely great for creating audiograms, and that's what I would recommend for anyone who's looking to make those.
How do you prepare for author interviews? So that's only usually typically once a month, and then you have other 3 episodes that are you and Diego. How do you prepare for the author interviews, the two of you?
So first read the book, and then so that's often helpful, and I would say that really helps you get in the mind of someone who wants to hear about this book, because the people who are listening to the interviews are one of two people. They either want to find out if they want to buy the book, or they are someone who loves the book and wants to hear the author talk. And so you kind of want to make the interview perfect for both those two people. So we kind of create a list of questions, and kind of, we don't like directly separate them, but we kind of separate them for ourselves. Like, what is the questions kind of for the first person? What are those questions for that second person who's already read the book? And so sometimes we'll even like have spoiler parts of the section. We'll say like, this is the spoiler time. You can like skip ahead if you don't want to hear spoilers. But what we're able to do is like ask questions. And also, I don't think this isn't just for author interviews. This is really for any time you're interviewing someone who's doing lots of interviews to promote something. They have a list of answers to a list of questions in their head. And so you can do this with any celebrity. If you look at like a celebrity's newest movie, and then you watch every time they're on a late night show, Jimmy Kimmel, Jimmy Fallon, Conan, whatever, right? And you'll see that, Jimmy Kimmel might ask them a question about food, and Jimmy Fallon might ask them a question like what movies they've been watching recently. But they're both going to have a core set of questions about promoting the movie. And then that celebrity is probably going to give a very, very similar answer to both those questions. And so one thing I've realized is, while that question might be good, you don't want to have too many of those. Because if you have too many questions that the author's already answered, what is the author getting out of speaking to you? And what are people getting out of listening to you? So that's why you want to also have a good amount of questions that not necessarily haven't been asked by the author before, but that the author hasn't prepared for and hasn't answered 10 times already.
A little bit more offbeat, a little bit more unique, personalized.
Yeah.
Like, what would an example of a sort of a typical question, like, oh, why did you write this book? Or like, what are some of those generic questions that you try to avoid?
Oh, that's good. So I guess I'm trying to think of a good, clear example. Like, why did you write this book is good. Is a good example. Why do you think this book is important? Why, what's the most like prevalent theme in the book? Questions like that, I think are probably good examples of questions to avoid. And also like picking out details is also really good to talk about. So that's also helpful when you've read the book. You can kind of close in on like one scene and ask like, what were you thinking when you're doing this thing? Because the author's always thinking something when they're writing a scene, right? And so if you get to hear that, that's good, especially because when you're picking out a specific scene, the author probably hasn't talked about that specific scene with every person they're talked to. So that's also a really way to get like a niche question.
Can you share any examples of like insights or interesting, surprising things that authors have told you in those interviews that were maybe, from those kind of offbeat questions? Or
Yeah, like one time we asked an author like how they were able to, like there was a specific scene at the end of the book that was that did that what wasn't good for the main character. It was a bit of a cliffhanger ending where something bad happened to them, and the author told us about like how that was really like sad to write for them, and then they were crying and talking to other people about how it was like so bad, and the other people were like, that doesn't seem like a big issue, you just wrote a sad scene in a book, and that was kind of a funny answer. I guess another time we've gotten something about that. An author told us about a autographing competition they had with Rick Riordan. They were doing a promotional event with Rick Riordan, and then they didn't tell Rick Riordan this, but they decided they were going to try to sign more books than he could, and they lost because Rick Riordan has been doing book signings for a very long time, and then that was such a funny, unique answer that actually. ReadRiordan.com, this was like very early in like a couple months of podcasting, they actually had like a fun facts about like Rick Riordan article for National Authors Day that like they hyperlinked our podcast because it was such a unique, fun facty answer to a question.
What have you learned about kind of interacting professionally with the quote unquote adult world from just organizing and setting up all these interviews? When I was your age, I mean, other than teachers, I didn't really interact with, the adult world, but you've been reaching out to authors, emailing them, coordinating times for meetings, sending follow-up notes and so forth. What do you feel you've learned from that whole process in terms of, I imagine you've probably gotten better at it and a little bit more comfortable with it.
Yeah. So one thing I thought at the beginning, and I don't know how saying this to any adults listening, I don't know how helpful this will be, but I think it'll be helpful to any kids who are listening or any kids you want to tell this information to. I think when I started out, I was worried that being a kid would be a detriment to me. No one wants to talk to a kid about something. But then I realized that I think there is a percentage of the time that's true. There's probably sometimes, but I would say at least 80% of the time, talking to adults professionally as a kid is a plus, because adults, aren't often talking to kids, pitching them ideas or asking for interviews. And so that's unique, that sticks in their brain, and that's usually something they want to say yes to. Because it's just a unique experience that they don't know when they're going to get to do that for the next time. Get interviewed by a teenager on a popular podcast. That doesn't happen a lot. And so I think that's a very interesting thing that I think most kids, they get anxious about, oh, I'm a kid and I'm trying to talk to this adult like they're an adult. But I think that's a good thing. I think, so not all the time, but I think there is a good amount of time when people say, oh, you're a kid and you're doing something that I wasn't doing when I was a kid. And they think that's cool. And I would say just don't don't get upset when you experience that other percent of the time when people are like, I don't want to talk to a kid because they're a kid. Because I think that's not the part to focus on. And I would say, so that's my main tip for any kids trying to do like something professionally. But I would say just in general, being polite, being respectful, and I don't know, just realizing that there's always trade-off. Like people, anytime you're asking something, you also should be offering something. So I think that's like anytime we're asking an author to come on the podcast, we're also promoting something. So if an author doesn't have a book coming out recently, but we want to talk to them, that's different because we're not really promoting a book that they want to promote immediately. Like when we wanted to talk to Rick Riordan's cover artist, he's a great guy. He probably would have talked to us to regardless. But I think it's really good that he also had a book that he had written, which I think is really amazing. I think it's called How We Got to the Moon, where he actually talks to people who had helped get to the moon with the Apollo trips, and he had talked to people who had actually worked on that. And he has this great illustrated book that has lots of information that is interesting about it, like written out, but then these amazing art drawings. So he had that book releasing later that year, and so if he didn't have that book releasing later that year, we wouldn't have been giving as much as we would have been asking for. But I think that there was a trade-off that increases the chance that they're going to say yes. So I think in the adult world, that's really important, having a trade-off with any interaction.
Now, in addition to, I reflect on kind of what I observe you learning in terms of skills from doing this podcast. And sometimes I wonder, if it's more than you're learning in some of your classes in school, because in addition to, the administrative skills of reaching out to writers and getting them on your show, you're also doing the editing. You're learning to use social media. You've set up a website, right? You have also done a few things with the website, like you have a merchandise store, and I know you guys set up a Amazon referral, Amazon affiliate links, right? Yeah. So tell me about some of the, from your point of view, the kind of the auxiliary set of skills that you feel you've picked up from doing the show.
I mean, yeah, I know how to edit a podcast now. I didn't really know how to do that before. And I also, I'm a film major, so like I learned editing stuff that like can help my film projects, and also when like I'm working on film projects, I learned editing stuff that I can help with my podcast. So that really goes two ways and is really helpful. I've learned, how to work with Wix. I still want to learn how to like do Squarespace, but I think Wix is just a useful skill that I now know how to do.
That's your website builder.
Yes, which is funny. It's kind of a step down because in 7th grade in computer science, we had like an HTML course. And now I'm using Wix, so I don't. Which I think a little funny. I do want to relearn HTML and stuff. I guess, learning how to promote merch, learning how to promote just learning how to use social media in an effective way, I think was really interesting and helpful. That's something I plan to use in the future, and I'm trying to think of. I've learned a lot from this podcast. There's not really one thing I would single down to, but there's lots of I think anytime you're doing something like mostly by yourself, I do have my co-host Diego, who's extremely helpful. He does a lot, but I think just anytime you're doing something almost 50% of the work, or more than 50% of the work, or if you're doing something that's 100% of the work, you're going to pick up various skills along the way that you wouldn't have learned. So it's great to collaborate people, and it's great to work with other people, and I think you should always involve other people in what you're doing. But I think anytime that you're doing this kind of hands-on project, there's a lot of amazing skills you can learn that you might never know when you're going to need them in the future.
You mentioned collaboration. Another thing that you've done, and you and Diego have done, is set up collaborations with other podcasts, right? Talk about that a little bit. I think you've done a fundraiser. I think you've done several shows where you collaborated.
Yeah, we did a live stream, a trivia live stream where we raised money for independent bookstores, which was really fun. And I'm trying to think of what else we've done. Yeah, we've gone on other podcasts. We've had other podcasts join us on our podcast to talk about various things relating to Rick Riordan's books. Obviously, one of the best things when you're doing collaboration, you want to find someone who is going to have some interest to the people listening. So, I'm glad to be here on your podcast, because I think I have something to add and contribute about being, an independent professional. But I think it would be less helpful for you to join us on our podcast about Rick Riordan. So that's always important. We have other Percy Jackson podcasters come on our podcast, as opposed to, again, for example, independent professional podcasts.
Right.
So that's always a fun thing to do, and that also increases the. Again, like I think other podcasts, I haven't again like you're reaching out to other podcasts on your level. Sometimes they're a bit higher than you, sometimes they're a bit lower to you in like downloads and popularity. But I think like again like reaching out, I'm not to say that you shouldn't reach out to podcasts that have tens of thousands more downloads than you, because you should always try. And again, not to say that a podcast with tens of thousands of downloads shouldn't reach out to a podcast with 5 downloads because they find that podcast and the host interesting. They also could do that. I'm just saying reaching out to people on the same level as you is also is a bigger guarantee of them saying yes to come on to your podcast, or having them guarantee yes coming on podcast, because then you're kind of really having your audiences join, and then it's better for the both of you. And I think overall just having it makes the whole situation more sort of calm and collected. And I there hasn't ever really been any difficulty in doing collaborations. We usually record our interviews ahead of time, but our collaborations are more last minute. We'll be like planning them like a week or 2 weeks. Sometimes we'll plan like the week of for our podcast, because they're so easy to do. And I think other podcasters, they kind of understand the game. They know how to record, edit just like you do. So there's that kind of connection that, well, you're probably not going to be talking about recording and editing on your Percy Jackson collaboration, but it's an easier way to connect on that fundamental level. You have something in common, more than just what you like to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That shared experience. So you're building relationships with other people in the same field. What advice would you give if another teen was thinking about setting up a podcast, maybe on some other author or some type of book, or on fantasy or science fiction, or some or some other topic, some other hobby of theirs? What advice would you give, based on what you've learned doing your show?
The number one thing is to stay consistent. I don't think we would have gotten to the point that we have if we haven't been releasing an episode as consistent as we have. I'm not to say we're the most consistent podcast in the world, but we had I think we had like a 50 episode streak where we didn't miss like an episode.
Every single week.
Yeah, every single week.
That's pretty solid. Right? Despite the pandemic.
Yeah. And so stuff like that's very helpful. Just staying consistent. That'll when you're consistent and people can tell you're consistent, when you reach out to someone, that means that they know, like they know they can trust you. They know that like joining your podcast will be a good deal. And that doesn't mean like you can always release 2 episodes, wait a couple months, and then reach out to someone and say, hey, I want to be on my 3rd episode of my podcast. And people might take that risk on you, and if they do, that's awesome. But I think making sure you're consistent, and even if you don't want to be a weekly podcast, at least letting everyone know I'm going to be a every other week podcast, and that's my deal. Then that people know that's you can be consistent and do what your kind of podcast promises. Then if you're able to do that, then people will like you. People will want to listen to you, because no one wants to listen to a podcast, get really into it, and then they stop releasing episodes. That's upsetting. So I think having that kind of way to prove yourself or promise something, just but by the time you get to your like 6th episode and you're releasing them consistently, that's already like a little bit of proof that you can do something. And then you can start reaching out to people and keeping yourself consistent throughout all that. That's a great way to keep doing it.
How do you and Diego prepare for your episodes that are not interviews?
That's a good question. The first things we always do is we find out our main thing of the episode, because every week we do our Demigod news, which is where we talk about, as I've mentioned, like the main focus of our podcast, what's new with regard, and what books have been announced, what covers have been released. But then the second thing we do is usually one of 2 things. Usually it's we review a book that just came out, or we make predictions on a book that's upcoming. And so we pick whichever one we're doing. And usually it's predictions, because only like 6 books come out a year. And so we're doing predictions on that, and then we're like, okay, how much research do we need to do, and what do we need to research on? So sometimes it's like the third book in the series. We already know the mythos of the world. We already have studied the mythology. Maybe we just need to like skim through the book and like see what skim through the previous books and see like what plot lines are we going to need to make predictions on for the third book, what continuations. Sometimes the book is like the first one in the series, and it's what mythology neither of us have ever heard about, right? Like we in the I think last month we did an episode on Hmong mythology because there's a book coming out based on Hmong mythology. I didn't know what Hmong mythology was before we started working on that podcast. So I was like, okay, so here's the things in the description of the book, right? So we know that the book is probably going to deal with souls, and it's going to deal with, there's going to be some dragons, and there's going to be some talking cats. So maybe I'll do the research on like souls and shamans, and Diego, you can do the research on dragons and talking cats. And so we find out where those ideas are in the mythology, in Hmong mythology, and then we kind of have to reverse engineer how someone would modernize that for a Rick Riordan Presents book. Then kind of the other thing we have to do is we have to collect the Demigod news. We have to see, okay, what are the important topics to talk about? Okay, that's 6 things. Is that too many? What's the least important thing here? Right? What do we cut? Or maybe it's like, this is only like 2 things. How do we get it up to 3 or 4 important news topics to discuss? And so then once we have all that, we have this show notes document that we have, and then we hit record and we run through it.
So you have Demigod news, you have predictions, you have a typical show opener, right? So give us your typical show opener.
Yeah, so Diego will be like, welcome to the Half Blood Report. I'll say what we do on the podcast. I've said this line like 20 more times, and I still don't know it by heart, but I'll be like, where we discuss like all things Riordan, or like we discuss Demigod news, like interviews and all other things Riordan, something like that. And then I'm like, Diego will be like, I'm Diego, your host, and I'll be like, I'm Samuel, your other host, or something like that. And then edit that out. And then one of us will be like, and later in the podcast, we're going to be making predictions on this book, or, we'll say later in the podcast, we're going to be reviewing this book. And then we will say, but first, like, let's do the Demigod news. We do the Demigod news. We talk about the news, and then we'll say, like, next, let's move on to our next section, and then we'll introduce the section. So if it's a Riordan review or an oracle section where we make predictions on the future book, and then we introduce the book. So we'll be like, what book are we talking about? Like, what's up with that? Who wrote it? What mythology is it based on? And then what we do for predictions books that are sequels, and for books for Riordan reviews when the book's already come out, what we do is we'll be like, this is our spoiler-free section. So we'll make predictions on the first book, so we'll make predictions on like a sequel without like mentioning what's been brought up in the previous books, which can be a little hard to do. And then we'll be like, or for our review section will be like, just this is what we thought about the book, our general thoughts. Like we liked, like I think in the most recent Riordan review, one of the things we said was like, we both thought the beginning and end were really, really strong, but we thought the middle, while good, was a little bit slow. That's one of the things we said, like, that's a spoiler for your section. And so then we'll be like, okay, now we're going into spoilers, and so we'll make predictions on a sequel in a series while like acknowledging the previous books, or we'll like review the book and say, oh my goodness, what did you think of that part of the book, or like that specific scene? Let's dive into our thoughts on like that little dilemma the characters had.
Changing gears just for a second, tell us, how did you decide to go to Frank Sinatra School of the Arts?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So I took the SHSAT and I got into the Bronx Science Specialized High School. And then I also the other school I got into was Frank Sinatra School of Arts, the film department. And so I really like film. I really like the medium, and I want to work in film when I grow up. So that was like, and then the alternative was Bronx Science, which has film clubs and stuff, but it's not nowhere near as developed or as focused as what I was going to be able to get at Frank Sinatra. And then I thought, it's also like it's a very rigorous school with a lot more kids. So I'm probably not going to have this good relationship with the teachers. And I'm also going to be being asked to do much more work. So I was like, I would rather have a school, like, even if I'm doing lots of work at Frank Sinatra, not to say there isn't a lot of work there, because there is. I would rather, be one of the teachers, like one of their 60 students, than be one of the teacher's 1,000 students. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah. So for listeners who are interested in the Half-Blood Report, where would you like to point them online, and we can include these links in the show notes?
Well, yeah. So you can just look up the Half-Blood Report on any like podcasting app, and we'll show up wherever you're listening to this. And then we also have a website, thehalfbloodreport.com, where you can find most of our stuff. If you click on the episodes tab of our website next to like where it says home, you'll be able to listen to our actual episodes right there. And you can scroll down and see all the episodes. And then, of course, we have our Instagram at The Half-Blood Report and our Twitter at Half Report. I don't know if there's anything else. I guess we have our merch, but you can also just find that at our website.
And listeners can also connect with you on LinkedIn.
I do have a LinkedIn. I don't check it enough as much as I should. But if you want to connect with me on there, that would be awesome.
Fantastic. So we will include those links in the show notes. Samuel, thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you so much for having me.